This is our video about our boat tour that we took of Gwaii Haanas.
It was awesome. It was the highlight of our summer.
Gwaii Haanas is in the southern part of Haida Gwaii. Gwaii Haanas is a national park, reserve, a marine conservation area, and also a Haida heritage site. There are no roads there. The only way to reach it is by airplane or boat.
The tour took us by float plane to the southern tip of Haida Gwaii, and a boat picked us up there and carried us back north through Gwaii Haanas. Its isolation makes it an absolutely pristine and beautiful place.
We wanted to get this video to you during the trip, but focus problem and other issues made it impossible to finish while traveling. However, this boat trip was so fantastic, we had to tell you about it, so we're completing this video now that we're back in Vancouver.
So the float plane picked us up at a dock in Queen Charlotte City. At the dock, we met our travel companions, a mother and daughter who were named Mary and Deanne, and a crew member named Jill.
The pilot's name was Peter. He packed our bags in the plane, and we took off.
We had a beautiful view of the Sound and the harbor.
We flew over mountains, islands, bays,
And we saw that North Haida Gwaii was logged extensively.
We could see bare patches, and the soil had been stripped away in places.
There appeared to be landslides caused by logging.
Yes, though Peter said that they were caused by the earthquake in 2012. However, most of the landslides seemed to happen in places where logging had occurred.
So we flew over Burnaby Narrows, where we later paddled in our kayaks.
After about an hour, we arrived in Rose Harbor, and we had the gentlest of landings.
Our boat was called the Island Bay, and it would be our home for the next 6 nights.
A Zodiac ferried us and our luggage from the plane to the boat.
Our captain was named Ryan, and Jill was his first mate.
The boat could have carried 5 to 6 passengers. However, there were only 4 passengers on board. Deanne, her mother, and of course, Susan and me.
There were also passengers from the week before on the boat, and they told us stories about...
Though they'd been sworn to secrecy not to.
Yes, they told us a little bit about what fun they had and what a great trip it was.
The Zodiac ferried them back to the plane, and then they took off back to Queen Charlotte City.
So we got settled, and Ryan gave us an orientation.
Let's say you've just gone to the bathroom. There is some toilet paper, whatever else is in the water that it came with. If you pump it on dry mode, it's just going to remove the water that was in there. Now the toilet paper, whatever's in there, may or may not go away. In this case, it did. That's no problem. But if it didn't, let's say, it would just pump to the side or something. So you've got rid of the water.
Then we got underway. On our first night, even the first few hours, we saw plenty of wildlife and interesting things.
Right away, we saw a humpback whale.
There's the tail again.
Yeah, that white patch on this side. They're usually symmetrical.
And later we saw crested puffins.
There were also plenty of fish. Ryan went fishing off the back of the ship. He wanted to catch a salmon, but he caught one black rock fish after another. He had 2 lines going, and he was jumping back and forth between them, and I think he caught 10 in rapid succession. And he basically just threw them all back until he finally caught the salmon that he wanted.
And it was a beautiful spring salmon. We spent our first night in a beautiful bay.
The next day, we headed south towards Cape St. James, at the very southern tip of Haida Gwaii.
Usually boats don't go to the southern tip of the island because of weather, but we were lucky.
The weather was calm and there were no waves, so we were able to go there.
And on the way, we stopped at a beach. And we saw small deer, and there were shells.
And we had a lovely walk along the beach, too.
And then, on the way back, we
saw another whale! Oh, yes. Anyway, we carried on to the Cape. We tried to land there. However, the water was too rough for the Zodiac to land. But we saw yet another whale.
And this one was really close to the Zodiac, which was so cool.
It was really cool, but it was hard to film because the whale would pop up over here, and before I could get my camera, he'd disappear again, and he'd pop up over there. Anyway, I couldn't. I'm sorry, I didn't get good footage. But when we got back to the boat, we almost came back to a disaster. The toaster had somehow gotten turned on and filled the boat with smoke.
Apparently a cutting board had fallen on the down switch to the toaster and kept it in that down position.
And the crumbs had caught fire. But fortunately, Ryan got in there and put the fire out. Our passports were there, our wallets, our keys.
Our clothes, credit cards, bank books, money, everything.
Everything. It would have been a real game changer.
Anyway, we carried on around the Cape where we saw seals.
Yes, there were tons of seals sunning themselves on the rocks and swimming around the Cape.
Going around the Cape is an unusual event. Usually it's quite windy and there are huge waves. There were swells.
Though there were swells, yes. And the boat sort of rocked back and forth and I got seasick. So I took some gravel and before I knew it, I was asleep in the bunk. And for some reason, Susan joined me.
Well, I hadn't slept well the night before, so I fell asleep too.
Anyway, we pretty much missed everything on the way back up until we got to Gwaii. Am I pronouncing it right? Gwaii.
As far as I know.
Yeah. So Gwaii is very famous. It's an UNESCO World Heritage Site. So we jumped in the Zodiac again, and we were greeted by a really nice Haida watchman by the name of David. He took us on a trail through a forest to the village site.
David showed us totem poles and longhouses. The house poles had been removed for preservation. They're now in museums, but the mortuary poles remain in place.
And all of them were over 130 years old because that was when the village was last occupied. Some might even be much older, maybe 200 or 300 years.
It was a beautiful location by a bay.
Protected by an island.
And David explained the history of the totem poles and what was left of them. After that amount of time, sometimes was not a lot left.
Anyway, after Gwaii, we went back to Rose Harbor where we had dinner at Susan's place. Would you say that the food was very good?
It was excellent. Maybe not as good as Ryan's cooking, but it was still very good.
And a lot of the food came from her garden in the back, which was incredible.
It was enormous. Ryan had brought some of the spring salmon that he had caught, so we got to eat it.
Rose Harbor also was an old whaling station. It was mostly gone now, but you could still see the remains of an old boiler and some other remnants here and there.
The next day, we headed north.
We found time to stop and go kayaking for the first time. We tried to paddle up a creek, but we couldn't, so we went to the other side of the bay and we saw a waterfall instead.
So I guess you could say you were up a creek without a paddle.
No, we weren't up the creek and we had paddles.
Okay.
After kayaking, we went further north and stopped at a bay. We were given a choice between a bog walk and a forest walk.
Mary wanted to go to the bog walk, so we all agreed.
Unfortunately, I decided not to bring my gumboots.
That was a big mistake.
But fortunately, Ryan lent me a pair because there was a lot of mud on this bog walk.
And after the bog walk, we managed to do the forest walk too.
So we did both the bog walk and the forest walk before continuing north to Burnaby Narrows.
And we saw a black bear on the way.
Yes,
Oh, it's just a big dog.
Burnaby Narrows is actually quite dangerous for boats.
To get through, the tides have to be at high tide, and there can't be too much current.
The Narrows is quite shallow and has huge rocks lurking beneath the surface. Even when the tide is high, the boat needs to do sharp S-curves to avoid hitting them.
Ryan showed Jill how to navigate safely around the rocks.
After Burnaby Narrows, Ryan took the boat a bit further north and set prawn traps in a small bay. Then we headed back down to the north end of Burnaby Narrows and anchored for the night.
And throughout the trip, Ryan somehow found the time to cook delicious meals for us.
It was incredible how Ryan could do a million things at once.
He ran the boat, he acted as tour guide, he solved all sorts of problems, he fished and cooked as well.
And after dinner, Deanne suggested that we go for a twilight paddle. I almost said no, but I am so glad that I agreed to go. It was mystical. The water was glassy flat, the air was still. It was the most incredible experience. I think it was the best part of the trip.
Well, I didn't go. It was day 3 and I wanted a shower, so it was a wonderful experience too.
The next day, we paddled up Burnaby Narrows at low tide.
We saw tons of sea life, sea stars, anemones,
Various types of seaweeds and clams spitting water back and forth.
and crabs.
And we also saw the massive rocks that we had somehow managed to avoid hitting the day before. It was really scary. Then we returned to the boat, and we returned to the bay where the prawn traps were.
And we pulled out 6 traps overflowing with spot prawns. We harvested several buckets of them.
Being a vegetarian, I did not participate. While Susan and the rest were tearing their heads off, I was saving crabs that got stuck in the traps. I was also throwing prawns back where I could. Deanne discreetly tossed a number of prawns back on my behalf.
They were too small, that's why.
What?
Then we went to Hot Spring Island.
Where there were change rooms and several hot pools.
There was a hot pool, medium, and at the top of the cliff, a nice hot pool.
Yeah, it was my favorite. After spending an hour in the hot pools, though, I was beginning to feel a bit ill. So I joined Mary and Deanne, and we had a dip in the ocean. And oh boy, was that water cold. But after the initial shock, it was very refreshing. I'm glad I did it.
I'm not. I don't like cold water.
Sheldon, the watchman, caught a big octopus.
Which he hung at the corner of a building. He had just caught it and it was all slimy.
After Hot Springs Island, we dropped anchor in the Bishkoff Islands. So the next morning, Susan, Deanne, and myself paddled around the islands.
The sun was out, the water was smooth and clear.
And yes, the water was glassy, flat. I think we saw even more sea life than in Burnaby Narrows.
It was like looking at an aquarium.
Yeah, we saw sea stars, cucumbers, jellyfish. There were seals as well.
Yes, we saw seals and lots of bird life.
In the afternoon, we headed to Windy Bay.
Windy Bay was the base camp for the protesters that fought against logging in the Gwaii Haanas area in the 1980s. The longhouse they built still stands, and there is a pole in commemoration of their work.
You can see the protesters on the pole with linked arms and rubber boots.
The protest led to the formation of Gwaii Haanas, which is a park, a nature reserve, and also a Haida heritage site. Parks Canada and the Haida agreed to disagree about whether it would be a park or Haida territory, so they have been co-managing it.
Ryan took us on a tour around Windy Bay. He showed us how to identify various kinds of trees, cedars, spruces, and so on.
The cedars were particularly important to the Haida because they were strong, easy to split, and resistant to decay. Cedar bark was used to make clothes and baskets. The wood from the cedar was split into planks to make longhouses, and the logs were carved into poles and canoes.
Ryan also showed us culturally modified trees, or CMTs.
CMTs have strips of bark taken off them for making clothing, baskets, and many more things.
Ryan also showed us an enormous tree, a huge spruce that we could not even form a ring around.
Yes, we all linked hands around the tree, and we didn't even get a third of the way around.
Yeah, that tree was enormous. Then we stopped at yet another beautiful bay for the evening, which was good because the next day was our last full day.
We went on a paddle around the bay. We saw sea stars, cucumbers, clams.
Then we left the bay and went into the Sound. It was immense and it was empty.
It was beautiful and unspoiled, and we were the only ones there.
There was no development for as far as the eye could see, no power lines, or roads.
No power boats or ferries passing through.
No docks, cottages, log booms. It was incredible.
Our boat came out and picked us up.
And then we headed to Tanu, which is another old Haida village site.
The watchman, Richard, told us the history of the village and showed us a lot of old longhouses.
Richard explained how Tanu had a population of about 500, and smallpox nearly wiped out the village. The town was abandoned when people were moved to other town sites.
Bill Reed's mother is from Tanu, and we saw the remains of her house. And then, I didn't expect this, but he took us to the edge of the village, and there was Bill Reed's grave.
Yeah.
He directed us there so nonchalantly, I just wasn't expecting it. But that was a pleasant surprise.
After Tanu, we went to another Haida village called Skidance.
And we met a watchman named Eric.
We saw more poles, more longhouse sites.
And especially we saw one pole that had 11 potlatch rings on it.
So the chief that pole honored had 11 potlatches. Wow, that must be some sort of record.
That's a sign of real wealth.
And real generosity. Can you imagine giving away all your stuff 11 times over?
Incredible.
So at the end of the day, we found yet another nice bay to stay in. And we sat in the stern of the boat and had dinner and watched the moon set.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
The last day was getting the boat ready for the changeover. We packed up our stuff and headed to Moresby Camp. Then we were driven back to Queen Charlotte.
The ferry ride was beautiful. We saw the Sound and Sleeping Beauty, which are some mountains that look like Sleeping Beauty lying on her back.
Mm-hmm. But the ferry ride paled in comparison to what we had seen on our trip. Ryan was a fantastic captain.
He was knowledgeable about everything. Running the boat, handling the kayaks.
He was a fantastic cook, and he knew all about the marine life, the trees, the animals, Haida history, the culture, and their traditions.
And he was also an expert in first aid.
Yes, Mary had sliced her finger while cooking, and he managed to patch her up and keep her going for the rest of the trip.
He was able to do several things at once and make it look easy.
And he was so calm and easygoing at the same time.
And Jill was a fantastic first mate, and Mary and Deanne were also fantastic companions to have on the trip.
Oh, Deanne led us in yoga each morning.
Yeah, and she wrote some lovely poetry for us at the end of the trip.
It was really a fantastic trip.
It was really a fantastic trip.
Yeah, it was the best trip ever.
If you want to go on the same trip, contact Archipelago Ventures. Their website is tourhaidagwaii.com, and their phone number is 250-652-4913.
Just be aware that you should book about a year in advance. We were lucky that a slot opened up with only 2 months advance notice. So if you're thinking about going to Haida Gwaii in a year or two, book now.
Yes, book now. It's a great trip.